I'm honored to be on this panel. I've long appreciated Allison's work on the New Testament, and I regard the resurrection of Jesus, apologetics, polemics, and history as the best book I've read on Jesus' resurrection, and perhaps generally the most engaging text I've encountered in recent years. I expected the book to be thorough and careful before reading it, but I did not anticipate just how comprehensive, persuasive, and stimulating it would be for new avenues of theological exploration, even if I had my share of minor disagreements. Allison positions his book between resurrection skepticism and defense, convinced that neither stance succeeds. Rather than trying to prove historically that Jesus did, or that God did or did not raise Jesus, Allison forges a middle path of presenting data, raising questions, and offering arguments and reflections on issues surrounding Jesus' resurrection. I want to reflect on Allison's case against resurrection apologetics, and in response, offer a defense of resurrection apologetics that broadly coheres with many claims he advances in the resurrection of Jesus. Throughout that work, Allison critiques those who, quote, seek to establish with some assurance or even beyond a reasonable doubt, that God raised Jesus from the dead. The question then is whether this critique succeeds. Much of the answer to this question initially depends on what we mean by establishing Jesus' resurrection with some assurance. I'm convinced that Allison succeeds in showing that the historical evidence does not prove Jesus' resurrection beyond a reasonable doubt, although I already believed that before completing Allison's book. More importantly, Allison, in my view, succeeds in showing that bare historical analysis should not convince many people of Jesus' resurrection, since there are alternative interpretations of the relevant historical evidence that do not require positing divine action. These alternative interpretations will likely be more rational for those without the right kind of background beliefs or worldview assumptions. Does this nonetheless mean that the apologist cannot establish the resurrection hypothesis, that is, the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead with some assurance, as Allison states? It depends on what we're looking for. Here's a realistic apologetic goal that might constitute the relevant level of assurance. The resurrection hypothesis is reasonably the best explanation of apparent historical facts, such as, for example, that Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers, and that various groups and individuals reported experiences of the risen Jesus a few days after his crucifixion. Notice three features of this stated apologetic goal. First, I said it's reasonable to conclude that the resurrection hypothesis best explains the historical data. The qualifier of reasonableness underscores that we see things only through a dark glass, where thoughtful people disagree and debate is ongoing. We nonetheless regularly and prudently judge, in the face of widespread sophisticated disagreement, that some idea is the best of the viable options. Second, the stated apologetic goal says that the relevant hypothesis is the best explanation of the relevant facts. This could mean that the resurrection hypothesis is more plausible than not, or it could mean that it's more plausible than the other competing hypotheses, even if it isn't more plausible than not considered by itself. The second reading is easier to establish, and often aligns with how hypotheses are confirmed. It thus seems to be the more sensible goal. Finally, I noted that the resurrection hypothesis seeks to explain apparent historical facts. We need to be cognizant that we are dealing with ancient texts, where, as Allison underscores, much is unknown. The uncertainty doesn't imply total ignorance, but reminds us that our reconstruction of the foundational data to be explained is provisional. Suppose the apologist can convince people that the resurrection hypothesis reasonably explains the relevant apparent facts best. Has the apologist done anything useful in that case, or has she only succeeded by setting the bar too low? I'm convinced the apologist has done something useful. Commitment to Christianity often involves both head and heart. Some people I know have had religious experiences insufficient to join or remain in the Christian faith, but have found such commitment much easier when these experiences are buttressed by rationalistic considerations. Others I know haven't had much by way of religious experiences, yet they want to become or remain Christian because it provides them with stability, meaning, and purpose. Rationalistic considerations that minimally show that Christianity is reasonable have helped these people foster Christian commitment. Since I think Christianity is true and helpful to its adherents, I say, blessed are the apologists who convince rational inquirers that the resurrection hypothesis plausibly explains the apparent facts best.
I love you, man. Question whether convince is the right word.
But how might the apologists contend that the resurrection hypothesis best explains the facts? Near the end of his book, Allison poses questions for resurrection apologists, including the possibility of non-Christian spiritual explanations of Jesus' resurrection, problems determining whether God would raise Jesus, and the implications of the resurrection if it happened. Allison emphasizes the importance of worldview, writing, quote, "The evaluation of the resurrection cannot be isolated from one's other beliefs. Such evaluation is rather a configural judgment, where the interpretation of one item depends on the interpretation of others. That is, the resurrection is not a topic unto itself, but a part that cannot be evaluated apart from some larger whole. Indeed, we cannot evaluate it independently of our evaluation of the nature of the world as a whole. A verdict about Jesus' resurrection cannot be made apart from one's worldview," end quote. I agree with this quote, with some qualifications that cannot be explained presently. Yet the resurrection apologist is hardly out of a job. To illustrate, I present the very broad contours of a worldview-infused resurrection apologetic. What I say probably won't be of much help to the historian qua historian, but I hope it's helpful to historians, or persons of all stripes, qua truth seekers. The approach outlined aligns broadly with Allison's claims about worldview in his book, yet still accords much significance or importance to resurrection apologetics. The approach I have in mind differs from the more idealized models of rational inquiry that many of us inherit from the Enlightenment tradition. Few people start from epistemic bedrock and systematically build from there, or itemize core candidate beliefs and affirm them only after sufficient rational inquiry. Much of us rather start from some received and often amorphous worldview or tradition, only to refine beliefs from there. Many seek to amend or abandon the worldview they have been given, but several of their key starting points are likewise informed by their worldview, making the principled assessment of it extraordinarily difficult. We are at sea, attempting to repair our boats. The difficulty notwithstanding, most of us can locate the key features of the main worldviews that vie for our allegiance. There will certainly be porous boundaries and areas of dispute, but I cannot say that this matters much for the apologetic method I'm describing. As long as the apologist can trace the main shape of a Christian worldview of some variety or another and compare it to other viable options, she can argue that her worldview better explains observed features of the world and human experience. Suppose then our Christian apologist describes a Christian worldview along the lines captured in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, focusing on its core metaphysical commitments. Recognizing that the existence of God is central to her worldview, she might then contend that theism explains the following data better than naturalistic atheism or non-theistic religions. 1, the existence of something rather than nothing. 2, a universe finely tuned for complex life. 3, the emergence of conscious beings. 4, the evolution of human moral awareness and agency. And 5, abundant theistic experience reports. Because of the explanatory power of theism, the apologist might reasonably argue that it is to be preferred, that theism is to be preferred over these other options. Allison notes that there are different Christian conceptions of God. There are understandings of God as tremendously loving and forgiving, or as transcending recognizable morality altogether, or as totally mysterious and unpredictable? Which conception matters for resurrection apologetics? Our apologists must narrow the options. If God is wholly unpredictable or transcends recognizable morality, confirming God's existence does little to support the idea that God would be interested in raising Jesus. To narrow the options, the apologist might argue that conceiving of God as morally good or as fundamentally motivated by love not only grounds moral truths, but also explains why God would create creatures capable of moral awareness and agency. The other competing conceptions of God, it could be maintained, don't enjoy the same degree of explanatory power, assuming the problem of evil can be sufficiently mitigated. Jesus' teachings plausibly reinforce the idea that God is good and loving. Most historical Jesus scholars would probably agree that Jesus likely understood God as sending rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous as an expression of fatherly love. Since we are assessing whether God raised Jesus from the dead, Jesus' conception of God surely is relevant. Suppose that our apologists can show that it's reasonable to think that there is a good God who cares about the affairs of this world. How reasonable could probably be left open to debate. It would likely suffice if the apologists could show that the idea that God is good and concerned about this world is approximately as plausible as leading alternatives, namely that God transcends recognizable morality, or whose fundamental intentions for this world typically rest far beyond our grasp. To the degree that we are comparing viable worldviews, we do not need to explore all logical space on this issue. With the reasonable judgment that there is a good and caring God in the backdrop, the next step for our apologists would be to argue that it's sensible to conclude that God would be interested in raising Jesus from the dead, should Jesus be publicly and unfairly crucified. Two kinds of evidence are relevant for this judgment. First, there is evidence derived from history. While I defer to historians, I would wager that our apologists could show, on historical grounds, that Jesus likely viewed himself as God's special anointed prophet, making manifest God's kingdom and fulfilling God's promises for the Jewish people. If something like this picture is correct, and Jesus understood his role correctly, it would not be terribly surprising to find that a good God who cares about humans would provide a way of vindicating Jesus should he be wrongly and publicly crucified. Jesus himself, according to Allison, plausibly prophesied not only his own death, but his vindication at the general resurrection. So if Jesus is the appointed spokesman for God, he apparently claims to be, we would expect some kind of vindication through resurrection, even if Jesus didn't give us a precise timeline. Conversely, if Jesus was not the messianic figure he presented himself to be, we would not expect anything like vindication by resurrection, something plausibly God must do or allow. Conceptual reasons also support divine interest in resurrecting Jesus. For example, Joshua Sijuwadi observes that the Abrahamic religions share the belief that God has sent a foundational prophet, someone who communicates divine revelation and helps establish a distinctive creed and community. Moreover, it makes sense to expect God to act in this way so that humans might learn how to live rightly and relate to God. Having a definitive foundational prophet, rather than a diffuse stream of equally authoritative figures, would also provide a clear focal point for understanding divine revelation and for integrating the insights of earlier prophets. We need a way of recognizing God's foundational prophet, especially if he is publicly crucified, and something like a resurrection would do the trick. There is finally Richard Swinburne's well-known case for the probability of the resurrection, which relies upon considerations a good God might have for becoming incarnate. Swinburne reasons that if Jesus is God incarnate, and Jesus were killed in the manner described in the New Testament, this would make it probable that God would raise Jesus from the dead. As for reasons to think that God would become incarnate, Swinburne maintains that it's not totally improbable to suppose that God, on account of his perfect goodness and love, would do this to provide atonement, to identify with our suffering, and to provide moral and spiritual information and encouragement. Swinburne then argues that Jesus' life marks him as being God incarnate. Historians and many theologians often respond with intense skepticism to the kind of a priori theological reasoning exemplified by Swinburne and Sijuati. I get it. How can we be expected to know God's mind in these proposed ways? Nonetheless, these ways of reasoning can function not as a decisive proof, but as raising credence, incrementally increasing reason to think that God would be interested in resurrecting Jesus should he be publicly and wrongly crucified. Certainty is unnecessary. It's sufficient to have some reason to suppose divine interest. Consider the matter in terms of worldview. It would likely rationally suffice to have a reason to think that there is an internal logic to the Christian framework, which can be rationally appreciated by those outside of it, that God would be inclined to resurrect Jesus if he were to be publicly and wrongly crucified. If one agrees to that, then it's reasonable to suppose that the resurrection hypothesis best explains the apparent post-crucifixion historical facts. To see why, turn to Allison's skeptical account of the resurrection evidence. Allison maintains that the skeptic may reasonably deny Jesus' resurrection via the following reconstruction of the relevant events. 1. Thieves stole Jesus' body from the tomb. 2. Due to tremendous grief, and perhaps after discovering the empty tomb, Mary Magdalene hallucinated seeing Jesus. 3. Peter, Paul, and maybe others experienced hallucinations of the risen Jesus, perhaps after hearing that Jesus had been raised and with some awareness of the empty tomb. 4. The idea that God raised Jesus from the dead came ultimately from Jesus' ministry. He had prophesied death and vindication at the general resurrection. Some of his early followers, perhaps on account of the empty tomb and vivid hallucinations, concluded that God's vindication of Jesus had occurred through resurrection just a few days after his death. 5. The collective appearances of Jesus, if accepted, can be explained by pareidolia or mass hysteria. Allison recognizes that a significant challenge to this skeptical scenario is that it's ad hoc and composite, lacking the simplicity and explanatory power of the more simple resurrection hypothesis. Nonetheless, Allison offers a two-part response to this challenge on the skeptic's behalf. He notes that the resurrection hypothesis is more complex than it initially appears. The hypothesis postulates several actions besides the resurrection, e.g., that God moved the stone, sent an angel, and arranged multiple appearances of the risen Jesus. I don't find this first response convincing. The defender of the resurrection hypothesis presumably holds that God raised Jesus from the dead to vindicate his his messianic mission publicly. Such vindication would naturally involve public demonstration or something like resurrection appearances. The various events surrounding the resurrection flow coherently from a single divine purpose. The supposed complexity of the resurrection hypothesis thus possesses internal unity. Allison's skeptical scenario, by contrast, requires multiple independent hallucinations vivid enough to sustain belief amid opposition, together with independent actors stealing Jesus' body for their own reasons. Reasons that, by coincidence, align closely with Jesus' prior predictions. One of these hypotheses is clearly more convoluted than the other. Allison's second response on behalf of the skeptic is the more significant of the two. He says, quote, important historical events regularly have multiple and often disparate causes. Why should belief in the resurrection be different? Real life does not always follow the odds, end quote. By way of response, life is certainly messy, and events often have multiple causes. It nevertheless seems obvious that we should not posit more causes than necessary when all else is equal. Additional causes bring extra assumptions that require justification, and thus more ways for the explanation to go wrong. In the case of belief in Jesus' resurrection, the more complex hypothesis could indeed be true, but ceteris paribus, it is not to be preferred. Of course, some people think that there is sufficient reason to postulate the more complex skeptical hypothesis regarding Jesus' resurrection. I submit the main reason for doing this isn't that the relevant historical facts alone commend the more complex skeptical hypothesis. Rather, the more complex hypothesis is preferred on account of one's background considerations, most notably considerations as to whether there likely is a God interested in raising Jesus under the relevant conditions. But now suppose that our apologist has already convinced us that there likely is a God who might well be interested in resurrecting Jesus. The more we have become convinced of this, the more reasonable it seems to judge that the resurrection hypothesis is the best explanation of the relevant historical facts. For what it's worth, I know scholars who have come to believe in Jesus' resurrection through a related series of steps. In fact, Philip Goff, the philosopher and public intellectual known for advocating panpsychism, recently embraced a form of Christianity after a long period of comparing the Christian worldview to other life options. Allison's book is cited as instrumental to the process of coming to believe the resurrection hypothesis best explains the data. In summary, I'm suggesting a comparative worldview resurrection apologetic. Here the Christian worldview is commended for the way it explains widely shared observations, rational intuitions, and historical data surrounding Jesus' crucifixion and the emergence of the Christian movement. The resurrection piece alone doesn't prove that Christianity, as traditionally understood, is true. Yet it does provide important evidence for a traditional Christian worldview, one that has quite a lot to say about the significance of that resurrection. Given Allison's emphasis on the importance of worldview for assessing the resurrection, it might be thought that I've said very little in this presentation that contradicts Allison's reflections in the resurrection of Jesus. Perhaps this is so. Yet Allison ends this book with critiques of resurrection apologetics and with an appeal to religious experience as that which truly justifies faith. I don't deny the importance of religious experience for many. I also don't think many of us need sophisticated arguments for rational belief in the risen Christ. Thank God for that. But many theologians have held that rationalistic arguments are available to those who do need them. I maintain that if one accepts that there is a God who might wish to raise Jesus, then on Allison's own historical grounds, it is reasonable to conclude that God did just that. And that judgment, I contend, lends significant support for the Christian worldview.